Today on the Perception and Action podcast, does training with lighter or heavier than regulation balls improve performance? What adaptations to coordination patterns do they encourage? Do they increase the chance of injury? So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before we get to today's topic, I want to tell you about a couple extra things that might interest you if you're enjoying the podcast. First, my book, How We Learn to Move, A Revolution in the Way We Coach and Practice Sports Skills, is now available in audiobook format. You can find it on Audible or Amazon. Second, if you're interested in working directly with me, I currently have openings in my monthly mentorship program. This includes monthly Zoom meetings, either one-on-one or with your staff, analysis of your practice designs, and a monthly group discussion with coaches and instructors from a range of different sports. To find out more, please go to patreon.com/perceptionaction. Now on to the show. Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception and Action podcast, back with another article review. In this episode, I want to focus on the topic of weighted ball training, right? So what we're looking at here is manipulating the weight of the ball used in your sport, whether you starting with the regulation ball, practicing with either a lighter one or a heavier one, and using that as a constraint in training, right? And the particular sport I'm going to focus on here and the task I'm going to focus on is baseball pitching, because that has been studied quite a lot. So if you think about it, there's a lot of reasons that manipulating ball weight could be beneficial. We could use it as kind of a differential learning just to add some variability to practice. We could use it as, to try to get you to change your technique in a certain way. In the baseball research, baseball pitching work, it's mostly been used to try to get pitchers to throw harder, increase their velocity. So I'm going to talk about that a lot. So that's what we're going to look at. Ball weight clearly is a task constraint, right? In the constraints-led approach, right? You're changing the and we see how it affects performance. So the main questions we want to look at, and I'm going to talk about a few different studies here, is altering ball weight, either increasing it or decreasing it, an effective way to improve performance? Or are there performance benefits? And as I said, we're mostly going to focus on velocity, pitching velocity here. What types of changes in coordination does it produce, right? That's an important thing. What adaptations are people making? Leading into the next questions, are these dangerous adaptations, right? Does training with, one of the things people have been very hesitant about, particularly in baseball pitching, is the chance that getting a pitcher to throw a heavier ball might increase the chance they're going to get injured, right? In a sport where elbow injuries and shoulder injuries are very, very common, getting a person to throw a heavier thing seems like it could lead to more injury. And what is the most effective way to implement it? I talked about some of the ways that ball weight could be used. What I'm going to suggest as we get towards the end is that I think people have been using it in the wrong way and kind of focusing on the wrong thing, in particular in baseball pitching. So first of all, let's look at some of the research findings. This is a systematic review done by Caldwell. As I said, in baseball pitching, this is used quite commonly. It's been studied for a long time. Amazingly, the first study to investigate weighted ball training in baseball was in 1966, right? So it's been around for a long time. This particular systematic review, they looked for weighted ball training with pitchers. In particular, they had a criterion that they measured pitch velocity, right, as a dependent measure, because that was the main thing they wanted to look at. Through all the literature, they found a total of 10 studies that met their criterion in their systematic review, right? And just to let you know, I'll talk a bit about in a second. Here's a set of weighted balls you can buy, right? Going from underweight to way underweight for baseball to way over the normal weight, right? So back to the previous figure, a regulation baseball is about 5 to 5 1/4 ounces, right? So 12 ounces is very, very heavy ball. And 2 is very much less. So here's the 10 studies they found, right? You can see they're using college and high school pitchers mostly. The first study in 66 actually used a pulley to simulate different ball weights. They didn't have different ball weights. Well, you can see they're going from a little bit overweight to quite a lot heavier than a normal ball in some cases, or some just slightly heavier than normal. Some of them include less than the normal weight. Some include lighter. 4 to 12 weeks in terms of training program. What I want you to note, though, is almost all of the studies, pretty much every study that was found, is using either an systematic incremental increase in weight. So every time each training session you add, you go into a slightly heavier ball, or they're just really alternating between an underweight and an overweight one in separate sessions. So there's not a lot of variability going on here, right? They're not getting you to throw a 5 ounce one time, then a 9 ounce, then a 4 ounce, then, so it's very, very systematic and predictable that's been going on. Okay. What was found in terms of performance, 7 out of the 10 studies reported a significant increase in pitch velocity pre to post training, right? What you can see is this ranges from, these are in miles per hour, from a 2 mile an hour increase, which is pretty significant in baseball, right? Going from 88 to 90 is quite a significant increase. Would help your career a lot for sure, to 11 miles an hour, which is an enormous increase in pitch velocity, right? So for the most part, the performance effects are very clear, right? Pitchers tend to throw harder, and I'll show you more evidence in a second. They throw harder after using weighted ball training, right? From the evidence, it's not clear the exact mechanism, right? In terms of whether it's doing the incremental, whether it's using more heavy balls, more lighter balls, right? It's hard to get, just some kind of weighted ball training seems to have an effect. In these systematic review, there's very few studies that talk, in these 10 studies, very few of them even mention anything about injuries, right? Most of them didn't follow the pitchers afterwards. The ones that did not report any injuries, right? So from this, things look pretty good. Like it looks pretty like a pretty beneficial training regime. But what I want to talk about, kind of mostly, this is, a more recent study. This was a randomized control trial, right? So this was where they took a group of pitchers and randomly assigned them either to weighted ball training or not, to a control group. They measured 6 weeks. It was a 6-week training program. They measured pitch velocity, but they also measured a lot of the biomechanics of pitching. They measured arm and looked at injury rate. So it's a very comprehensive, very nice study. Okay. So as I mentioned, it's a randomized control trial using pitchers between 13 and 18. There was 38 total pitchers, 19 per group, to either the control or the weighted ball group. They took a bunch of baseline measurements, not only in terms of performance, in terms of velocity, but they also measured ranges of motion, strength, how much could you push with your shoulder, and, so a bunch of different metrics like this, and they did 6 weeks of training. The control group did the regular training with explicit instruction, don't add any manipulation in ball weight during your regular training, right? So I mentioned ball weight training is pretty common now, throwing a heavy ball or a lighter ball. So it would be likely that they might be doing it already, but they were told not to. The weighted ball group, they did during the off season, so not during the, so 3 times per week. They made throws from 3 different positions: knees, okay, on their knees, a rocker position where you kind of slowly transition from one of the phases of the delivery to the other, and I'll show you a picture in a second, and run and gun where actually you're throwing on the run. They did 3 different intensities. They had a progression of ball weights from 2. Remember, regulation is about 5 and a quarter. So 2, like half the weight of a regular ball, to 32, which is way, way more, right? And in terms of the amount of throws they're making, they're only throwing 3 times. How often they're doing it. This is a relatively conservative program in terms of how much, in demands it's placing on the pitchers, right? Compared to some of those other studies I talked about. But this is the basic. So there's a little bit of variation in going in terms of how you're throwing, in terms of intensity. But again, we're using the incremental ball weight. What did they find? Okay. Here's this rocker position, right? Where you're going through these very discrete positions and throwing. Here's and also just to give you an idea of, they're only doing 3 reps with a heavy ball or 2, so it is so total throws of volume of throws made with a heavier ball is in a whole week of training 35, right? So at the max. So that's not very much. It's not a super intense program. That's kind of something to point out. Okay. What did they find? What they found was the first finding in terms of performance. They replicated the basic findings, a bit more modest, which maybe is not surprising because it's fairly conservative training design. They found that the weighted ball training group increased by 1 mile per hour. They had a 1 mile per hour on average increase in pitch velocity, 1 meter per second, right? Which is a 3% increase, which is fairly significant. The training group did not. They had there was a 0.3 meters per second increase, which was not significant. Okay. Interestingly, and we'll talk about this in a second, there was no significant change in the actual arm velocity, right? How fast their arm was moving while they were delivering it. There was only in the actual ball. Okay. Interestingly, and not really talked about in many of the other studies, there was some evidence for quite big individual differences in the effect of this, right? So 80% of the weighted ball training pitchers increased velocity. 8% stayed the same, and 12% actually decreased after training. Interestingly, 67% of the control group increased velocity too, right? So they were showing 19 had no change and 14 had a decrease, right? So it's not the case that every pitcher increases velocity with a weighted ball and everyone in the control group didn't, right? There's some individual differences going on. And I think that's important to point out. What about injuries, right? This is, as I said, the one big difference between this study and the other ones is they did a very systematic cataloging of injuries. They followed pitchers into the next season. And what they found was that 4 pitchers in their study couldn't complete the study. They were all in the weighted ball group, right? 4 pitchers in the weighted ball group suffered elbow injuries, stress fractures, partial or full tears that required surgery, okay? 2 of them occurred during the actual training program. 2 of them occurred in the following season, okay? There was also 2 group participants that got lower extremity injuries in the weighted ball training. So leg injuries, knee injuries. So all of these injuries, which is a total of 6, was all from the weighted ball group, right? The control group had no injuries at all. So that's, pretty striking, right? Pretty striking that, yes, we're getting these performance benefits, but at what cost, right? What we're seem to be getting a lot of injuries happening here. Why do we get these injuries? Well, if you dig deeper and you look at the coordination training, what the adaptation the pitchers are making to this systematic incremental increase in ball rate, what they found was that the biggest change, so as I mentioned, it's not their arms moving faster. The biggest change in the mechanism that seems to drive the increase in pitching velocity is an increase in the external rotation of the shoulder. Right. So basically, at the maximum, your arm is way back. It goes back a bit further. And what they're finding is, in terms of degrees, about almost a 5% change, 5-degree change in increase in the external rotation of the shoulder. So your shoulder's going back, your arm's going back further. There was a slight increase in the internal rotation. Not really much going on in the elbow. A bit more extension, right? You could see the control group actually all went down. They had lesser rotation after training. None of these were really significant, but clearly they did not get this big change, right? Why is this external rotation occurring, right? This is consistent with previous studies the same group has done, just looking at biomechanics of pitchers. What they found, the more that you can rotate your shoulder over the wider range. So say if you normally can get it to 110 degrees so if your arm's straight above you, you can rotate it 110 degrees backwards. If you can increase that to 115 degrees, what you're doing is, giving a greater range of motion, right? And they found in previous biomechanical studies, when you take a bunch of different pitchers and you compare who throws harder and who throws less hard, the ones that throw harder typically have a greater external rotation of the shoulder. And if you think about it, what's happening here is, we're just giving a greater arc over which you can apply force, right? the longer you rotate your shoulder for, the more force you can apply to the ball and the faster you can make it go, right? So this increase in the range of motion in the shoulder is an adaptation which allows you to throw harder. From the injury data, though, it seems to be quite a dangerous one, right? It's putting a lot of stress on the other joints in the elbow and the shoulder, even though it's giving you the performance outcome you want, okay? So in sum, right, for weighted ball training for baseball pitching, the bulk of the evidence shows that it works. As a task constraint, it increases pitching velocity, but it seems to come at this very potentially dangerous and maladaptive adaptation in the coordination pattern. This increase in the passive range of external rotation in the shoulder, right? We see this in higher in the randomized control trial I just talked about, all those injuries. It doesn't mean everyone's going to get injury, but it certainly seems to increase the chance. Also, Fleissig and colleagues at ASMI have done a study, and they've looked at, okay, what are the factors that are related to pitchers getting injury? And what they found is that the pitchers with the highest external rotation, amount of rotation, range of motion, are much more likely to get injured, right? Even if without weighted ball training, right? It's just a good predictor of injuries, right? And the two players that had the worst elbow injuries in the randomized control trials happened to be the two that had the greatest external range of motion in their shoulder, right? So everything's pointing at, yes, this makes you throw harder, and it makes sense why, but it's not a good effective adaptive change because it's increasing the chance of injury. What can we do about this? Well, I think, the answer might be rethinking what we're trying to achieve with this weighted ball training, and specifically in baseball pitching and in other sports, right? Instead of focusing on this move towards increasing pitching velocity by using this incremental changes, I think if we refocused it in terms of adaptability, right? Your adaptability to changes and constraints, so in varying the ball weight more, right? Instead of using the incremental increase, varying it from pitch to pitch, so people adapt their body to these changes in weights instead of building to this more weight, which leads to this maladaptive change. Focusing more on lighter balls, Fleissig et al. Has shown that whereas heavy balls actually have these maladaptive, there's actually some adaptive, useful changes that occur when you practice with a lighter ball, right? So getting more lighter ball mixed in, I think, is beneficial. Could be beneficial. More variation in the other aspects: mound, slope, flat ground versus steep mound, uphill, distance of the throw. Okay, adding constraints that require changes in lower body coordination, right? So what you're seeing is, because it's this very simple change in we have to be careful with very systematic, simple changes in task constraints like increasing ball weight. They can lead to very simple, dangerous adaptations like this rotation, right? If I, at the same time I'm increasing ball weight, I put something in the ground that makes you have a bigger stride, for example, or something like that. Maybe I can get to, help your body find a solution that incorporates the lower body too, to deal with this heavy ball, rather than just incorporating greater range of motion in your shoulder, right? So pushing the system so it doesn't settle in this local minimum of just having more external rotation of the shoulder, pushing it to find an even better and more broader solution to all these constraints, not this systematic increase in ball weight, right? So I think there's potential here for sure, but we need to be careful how we implement it. I think focusing on adaptability is the key. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Thanks for joining me. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled. Gone straight away.